Picture this: an army marches confidently across open ground, swords gleaming, shields locked tight. They outnumber their enemies 3 to 1, their commanders certain of victory. But in an instant, the earth gives way beneath them. Hidden pits swallow entire ranks, while carefully disguised spikes impale those who stumble forward. Chaos erupts as arrows rain down from unseen positions. What seemed like certain triumph becomes a massacre, all because of a trap laid weeks in advance. This wasn't just bad luck, it was a masterclass in ancient warfare, where brains routinely outmaneuvered brawn. Across centuries, the most brilliant military minds didn't rely on strength alone. They engineered devious, almost theatrical traps, each one designed to exploit overconfidence, fear, or even the simple need for shelter. Some were so effective that entire battles ended before they began, with enemies fleeing at the mere rumor of what might lie ahead. And the most astonishing part, many of these traps weren't just deadly, they were works of art, blending psychology, engineering, and sheer audacity. Think about the stakes for a moment. In an era where a single defeat could mean the collapse of a kingdom, generals couldn't afford to leave anything to chance. Every river crossing, every mountain pass, every stretch of open field was a potential death trap waiting to be activated. Some traps played on basic human instincts like the lure of abandoned treasure or the safety of a hollow log, while others exploited the environment itself, turning nature into a weapon. The best ones didn't just kill, they demoralized. Imagine being a soldier who watches your entire vanguard vanish into a camouflaged trench, or realizing too late that the retreating enemy has led you straight into a killing zone. These weren't just tricks, they were psychological warfare designed to break an army's spirit before the real fighting even began. What makes these traps truly fascinating isn't just their brutality, it's their legacy. Many of the strategies developed thousands of years ago still echo in modern military doctrine. The principles of misdirection, the use of terrain, the careful study of enemy behavior, these are timeless. And beyond warfare, there's something deeply human about these innovations. They speak to our ability to adapt, to think creatively under pressure, and to turn limitations into advantages. So how did these traps work? Who were the masterminds behind them? And what can they teach us about problem solving today? Over the next 23 examples, we'll uncover the hidden brilliance of ancient warfare, where a well-placed pit or a cleverly timed feint could change the course of history. Get ready, because some of these traps are so ingenious you'll wonder why no one thought of them sooner. The Trojan Horse stands as more than just a clever trick. It was a stroke of psychological genius, exploiting human nature itself. The Greeks didn't just build a wooden decoy, they crafted a story so believable it bypassed suspicion entirely. Think about the details that sold the lie. The horse's imposing size made it seem like a sacred offering. The Greeks' staged departure mimicked genuine retreat, and the whispers of their defeat spread like wildfire. But here's the twist. The trap wasn't just about hiding soldiers inside. It preyed on the Trojans' pride. After years of siege, the idea that their enemies had given up, leaving behind a tribute to the gods, was too satisfying to question. Victory felt earned, not handed to them. That's why no one stopped to ask why the Greeks would build such an elaborate gift, or why they'd abandon it so hastily. What's often overlooked is how the horse played on ritual and superstition. In the ancient world, refusing an offering to the gods was unthinkable. It risked divine wrath. So when the priest Laocoon warned, "I fear the Greeks even bearing gifts," his skepticism clashed with centuries of tradition. The Trojans weren't just fooled, they were trapped by their own beliefs. And that's the hallmark of a perfect deception. It doesn't just trick the eyes, it manipulates the mind. The Greeks didn't need brute force to topple Troy. They let the Trojans open their own gates, literally and psychologically. The horse's legacy isn't just its success, it's how it reshaped warfare forever. After Troy, no fortress was truly impregnable. Generals realized that walls could be bypassed if you outthought the enemy instead of outmuscling them. Even today, the term Trojan Horse describes any attack that disguises itself as harmless, from computer viruses to espionage. But here's the real lesson. The trap worked because it wasn't just a wooden statue. It was a story the Trojans wanted to believe, and that's the danger of deception. It thrives on our willingness to trust the things that align with our hopes, fears, or pride. The Greeks didn't just win a battle that night. They wrote the playbook on how to turn an enemy's confidence into their greatest weakness. The Carthaginian fireships weren't just weapons. They were a stroke of ruthless creativity, born from one simple fact: Carthage was outmatched. Rome's navy dominated the Mediterranean, its sleek warships crewed by skilled sailors. But the Carthaginians refused to play by Rome's rules. Instead of facing them ship to ship, they turned their own weakness into a weapon. Imagine the scene: a cluster of decrepit vessels, seemingly abandoned, drifting toward the Roman fleet. To the untrained eye, they might have looked like salvage, until the first flames erupted. These weren't just burning boats, they were floating traps packed with dry timber, oil, and sulfur, transforming the sea itself into a killing field. What made this tactic so devastating wasn't just the fire, it was the chaos. Roman crews, trained for orderly naval combat, suddenly faced an uncontrollable force. Flames leaped from ship to ship, sails became infernos, and the tight formations that gave Rome its advantage dissolved into panic. The Carthaginians didn't need to board a single vessel to win. They let physics and psychology do the work. Fire on water is unnatural, unsettling, and that psychological shock was as lethal as the flames themselves. Rome's failure to anticipate this move reveals a timeless lesson in warfare. Arrogance blinds. The Romans assumed Carthage would fight conventionally, matching strength against strength. But the fireships were asymmetrical warfare at its finest, a cheap, scalable solution that neutralized Rome's expensive fleet. It's no coincidence that similar tactics reappeared centuries later, from Byzantine Greek Fire to the explosive-laden drone boats of modern conflicts. The brilliance of the fireships lay in their simplicity. They required no advanced technology, just a willingness to see the battlefield differently, to turn the very elements against an enemy. Yet there's an irony here. While the fireships bought Carthage time, they couldn't change the war's outcome. Why? Because traps alone don't win wars, they buy opportunities. Carthage's real mistake was failing to capitalize on the disruption they'd created. That's the double-edged sword of asymmetrical tactics. They can level the playing field, but without follow-through, they're just spectacular distractions. The fireships remain a masterclass in ingenuity, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a sword or a spear, it's the audacity to set your own ships ablaze. Alexander the Great's cavalry was legendary, a thunderous force that could shatter enemy lines in minutes. But at Gorgamela, the Persians had a plan to turn that strength into a liability. Hidden just beyond the battlefield lay a network of ditches, each one filled with sharpened stakes and carefully camouflaged under layers of brush. These weren't just pits, they were precision instruments of chaos, designed to cripple horses mid-charge and send riders tumbling into a deadly maze. The moment Alexander's cavalry surged forward, the ground literally vanished beneath them. Horses stumbled, formations broke, and the Persians seized the opportunity to unleash volleys of arrows into the disarray. What made these ditches so effective wasn't just their brutality, it was their timing. The Persians didn't scatter traps randomly. They placed them exactly where Alexander's cavalry would be most vulnerable at the climax of their charge. This forced the Macedonians to either slow their advance, losing momentum, or risk catastrophic losses. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare, exploiting the very aggression that made Alexander's forces so formidable. The lesson: even the most disciplined army could be undone by a well-placed obstacle. But Alexander didn't earn his title by accident. His response to the ditches revealed why he remains one of history's greatest tacticians. Instead of retreating or panicking, he adapted on the fly. He redirected his cavalry, using feints and probing attacks to map the trap network, then adjusted his entire battle plan to avoid the worst of the hazards. This flexibility turned a potential disaster into a showcase of his leadership. Where others might have doubled down on brute force, Alexander recalibrated, proving that the real art of war wasn't just in charging forward, but in knowing when to pivot. The spiked ditches at Gorgamela highlight a recurring theme in ancient warfare. The best traps weren't just about killing enemies, they were about controlling them. By forcing Alexander to waste precious time and energy navigating the hazards, the Persians disrupted his rhythm and dictated the pace of battle. Yet in the end, it was Alexander's ability to think beyond the trap that sealed his victory. The ditches bought the Persians time, but not enough. And that's the delicate balance of military deception. It can stall an enemy, but without a decisive follow-through, even the cleverest trap is just a temporary setback. Rome had a problem. Their soldiers were unmatched on land, but at sea, Carthage ruled the waves. The Carthaginians had spent generations perfecting naval warfare, their ships dancing around slower Roman vessels with ease. But Rome refused to play to their enemies' strengths. Instead, they built a trap that turned the ocean into solid ground, the Corvus. Picture a massive wooden bridge, hinged at the bow of a Roman ship, tipped with an iron spike like a predator's claw. When enemy vessels drew close, the bridge would slam down, impaling their deck and locking the ships together in an instant. Suddenly, Carthage's nimble sailors weren't battling at sea. They were facing Rome's disciplined legionaries in a brutal melee, where every advantage of wind and tide meant nothing. The Corvus wasn't just a weapon, it was a psychological masterstroke. Carthaginian crews, trained to outmaneuver and outshoot their foes, found themselves trapped in a fight they'd never prepared for. Imagine the shock as Roman soldiers, shields locked, poured across that bridge, turning a naval skirmish into a blood-soaked infantry brawl. The Corvus erased the line between land and sea, proving that warfare isn't about playing fair, it's about rewriting the rules entirely. And for a brief, terrifying period, it worked. Rome's early naval victories weren't won by superior sailors. They were won by turning the sea into an extension of the battlefield they already dominated. Yet the Corvus had a fatal flaw, one that reveals the delicate balance of military innovation. The device was so heavy it made Roman ships unstable, especially in rough seas. After losing entire fleets to storms, Rome quietly abandoned it. But here's the twist: by then, the damage was done. The Corvus had given Rome's navy the confidence and experience to stand toe-to-toe with Carthage, even without the trick that started it all. That's the hidden power of traps. They don't just win battles, they shift expectations. Carthage never fully recovered from the psychological blow of seeing their naval supremacy shattered by a gangplank with a spike. What makes the Corvus timeless isn't just its brutality, it's the lesson in asymmetric thinking. Rome didn't try to outsail Carthage, they forced Carthage to fight Rome's way. And that's a strategy that echoes far beyond ancient warfare. From tanks with grappling hooks to modern cyber warfare, the principle remains: the best traps don't just exploit weakness, they redefine the game. The Corvus was a short-lived experiment, but its legacy is eternal. Sometimes the way to win isn't to adapt to the battlefield, it's to drag your enemy onto yours. The hollow log ambush wasn't just a trick. It was a symphony of psychological warfare, composed by ancient Chinese strategists who understood something profound: sound could be deadlier than steel. Picture a dense forest at dawn, where enemy scouts tense at the distant rumble of what seems like an advancing army. Drums echo through the trees, growing louder, closer, except there are no soldiers. Just hollow logs, meticulously placed and filled with drumheads, tumbling downhill to create the illusion of an unstoppable force. The enemy, convinced they're about to be overrun, flees straight into a waiting kill zone or scatters in disarray, their formation shattered before a single arrow is loosed. What made this deception so devastating was its simplicity. No elaborate machinery, no costly weapons, just an understanding of human psychology. In the fog of war, the mind clings to familiar patterns. The rhythmic thud of drums signaled order, discipline, and impending violence. By weaponizing that expectation, the Chinese turned fear itself into an ally. Imagine the panic of soldiers who'd trained for visible enemies, now straining their eyes in vain as the sound of doom rolled toward them. This wasn't just misdirection. It was a masterclass in exploiting the gap between perception and reality. But the real genius lay in the trap's adaptability. Hollow logs worked in mountains, forests, even narrow valleys where echoes amplified the effect. Unlike physical barriers, sound couldn't be outflanked or dismantled. And because the ruse left no trace, no pits to avoid, no spikes to spot, enemies often fell for it repeatedly. Some accounts suggest variations where logs were replaced with bronze vessels struck like gongs, creating eerie, metallic reverberations that felt supernatural. That unpredictability was key. When you couldn't trust your ears, how could you trust anything? The legacy of these sound traps echoes far beyond ancient battlefields. Modern militaries still use auditory deception, from dummy radio transmissions to fake artillery recordings. But the core lesson remains unchanged. Warfare isn't just about overpowering the body, it's about outthinking the mind. The hollow log ambush proves that sometimes the most lethal weapon isn't a blade or a bow. It's the unsettling realization that the threat you're running from might not even exist. The Byzantine Greek fire wasn't just a weapon, it was a nightmare made liquid, a substance so horrifying it defied every known rule of warfare. Picture the scene: enemy ships closing in on Constantinople, their crews confident in their numerical advantage, only to face jets of flame that clung to wood and flesh alike, burning even as it danced across the waves. Water only spread the fire, sand couldn't smother it. The more you fought it, the harder it burned, and the Byzantines knew exactly how to weaponize that terror, mounting flamethrowers on their ships that could spew destruction at terrifying range. The mere sight of those bronze siphons was often enough to send seasoned sailors into retreat. What made Greek fire so devastating wasn't just its physical effect, it was the psychological warfare woven into its use. The Byzantines guarded its formula with obsessive secrecy, ensuring no enemy could replicate or counter it. Some historians believe the recipe included crude oil, pine resin, and quicklime, creating a sticky, self-igniting gel. But the true genius lay in the delivery system: pressurized tubes that allowed crews to aim the flames like dragons breathing death. Opponents didn't just fear the fire, they feared the unpredictability of its arrival. Would it strike the sails, leaving crews stranded in a floating inferno? Or would it coat the decks, trapping soldiers in a prison of their own burning ship? Enemies tried everything to counter it and failed spectacularly. Some soaked their sails in vinegar, hoping to dilute the flames. Others draped wet hides over their ships, only to watch the fire seep through. The Venetians once built wooden barriers lined with hollow tubes, pumping seawater to create a constant damp shield. It worked until the Byzantines simply aimed higher, igniting the masts and rigging where the water couldn't reach. Every attempted countermeasure revealed the same brutal truth. Greek fire didn't just outmatch existing tactics, it rendered them obsolete. But the real power of Greek fire wasn't in its flames, it was in the myths that grew around it. Rumors spread that it was divine punishment or alchemy gone mad, or even a relic of ancient sorcery. The less enemies understood, the more terrifying it became. That's the paradox of psychological warfare. Sometimes the most effective weapon is the one shrouded in mystery. The Byzantines didn't just burn ships, they burned certainty, leaving their foes paralyzed by doubt. Even today, historians debate whether Greek fire's true legacy was its destructive power, or the way it proved that in war, the mind is always the first battlefield. The Viet Cong tunnel networks didn't emerge overnight. They were the culmination of centuries of guerrilla wisdom, refined by generations of Vietnamese warriors who knew their land could fight back. Picture a sprawling underground city, stretching for miles beneath the feet of an invading army. Hidden entrances led to cramped passageways barely wide enough for a single person, twisting and turning in deliberate confusion. Some tunnels dropped suddenly into water-filled traps, while others branched into dead ends designed to disorient. But these weren't just escape routes, they were full-scale military bases, complete with makeshift hospitals, weapon caches, and even theaters where soldiers could briefly forget the war above. What made these tunnels so formidable wasn't just their complexity, it was their adaptability. Ancient Vietnamese fighters had used similar tactics against Mongol invaders centuries earlier, exploiting the dense jungles and swamps to negate the enemy's superior numbers. The Viet Cong took that legacy and industrialized it. They lined tunnels with bamboo supports to withstand bombs, carved ventilation shafts disguised as termite mounds, and even rigged false walls to collapse on pursuers. Every inch was a psychological weapon. Imagine being an American soldier trained for open combat, suddenly forced to crawl through pitch-black corridors where the next turn could lead to a sniper's bullet or a punji stake pit smeared with feces to ensure infection. The tunnels turned warfare into a claustrophobic nightmare where the enemy was everywhere and nowhere at once. Yet the real genius of these networks lay in their simplicity. Unlike high-tech fortifications, they required no rare materials, just dirt, sweat, and an intimate knowledge of the terrain. The Viet Cong didn't just dig tunnels, they wove them into the landscape, using riverbanks, rice paddies, and even graveyards as camouflage. This wasn't just hiding, it was a form of environmental warfare, turning the very earth against an enemy who couldn't tell where the battlefield began or ended. And because the tunnels were decentralized, losing one section meant little. Like a hydra, the network regrew faster than it could be destroyed. The tunnel's legacy transcends Vietnam. From the Ku Kai fighters who outlasted bombardments to modern special forces studying their designs, these labyrinths proved that resilience often beats raw power. But here's the twist: their success wasn't just about engineering, it was about patience. While Western armies sought quick victories, the Viet Cong played a longer game, willing to wait years for the perfect ambush. That's the timeless lesson of tunnel warfare. Sometimes the strongest defense isn't a wall. It's the willingness to dig in, both literally and metaphorically, until the enemy exhausts themselves trying to find you. The Mongol fake retreat wasn't just a tactic, It was a theatrical performance, honed to perfection by warriors who understood that the most lethal weapon wasn't an arrow, but human arrogance. Picture a band of Mongol horsemen scattering in apparent panic, their formation dissolving as they fled across the steppe. To an enemy commander, it looked like victory was within reach. But this was no retreat. It was a carefully choreographed dance designed to lure pursuers into a slaughterhouse of their own making. As the enemy gave chase, their ranks stretched thin, their discipline frayed by the thrill of the hunt. That's when the trap snapped shut. Hidden archers positioned in advance would rise from the tall grass or emerge behind hills, raining arrows onto the now disorganized pursuers. The Mongols didn't just win battles, they staged them. What made this tactic so devastating wasn't just the ambush itself, but the psychology behind it. The Mongols studied their enemies like actors studying a script. They knew which cultures valued honor above caution, which commanders would rather die than appear cowardly. By feigning weakness, they turned those very traits into weapons. A European knight trained to chase a fleeing foe would charge straight into the killing zone. A Persian general, eager to avenge earlier skirmishes, would push his exhausted troops too far. The brilliance lay in its adaptability. The Mongols could execute this ruse on open plains, in mountain passes, even outside city walls, always adjusting the performance to suit their audience. Discipline was the invisible backbone of the fake retreat. Unlike undisciplined armies that might collapse into real panic, Mongol horsemen maintained perfect control even as they seemed to flee. Riders communicated with subtle signals, a lifted hand, a shifted saddle orchestrating their retreat with the precision of a symphony. The moment the enemy overextended, those same riders could wheel around, transforming from prey to predators in seconds. This wasn't chaos, it was chaos engineered, and it worked because the Mongols understood something fundamental about warfare. Confusion is contagious. Once the enemy believed they had the upper hand, they stopped thinking critically. Genghis Khan didn't invent the feigned retreat, but he refined it into an art form. He drilled his armies relentlessly, ensuring every rider knew their role in the deception. Scouts mapped terrain in advance, identifying perfect ambush points. Messengers relayed orders with terrifying efficiency. The result was a force that could pivot from retreat to attack faster than their enemies could react. At the Battle of the Kalka River, this tactic annihilated a larger Russian force. At Mohi, it decimated Hungarian knights. Each victory reinforced the same lesson. In war, the line between pursuit and peril is thinner than a razor's edge. Yet the true legacy of the Mongol fake retreat isn't just its body count. It's how it reshaped warfare forever. Long after the Mongol Empire faded, generals from Napoleon to Rommel studied its principles. Modern militaries still train in feigned withdrawals, proving that some tricks never lose their edge. But here's the twist. The tactic's greatest power wasn't in the arrows or the ambushes. It was in the doubt it planted. After facing the Mongols, enemies would second-guess every retreat, every apparent victory. And that psychological shadow, the fear that every step forward might be a trap, was often more paralyzing than the ambushes themselves. The Mongols didn't just defeat armies, they weaponized uncertainty. The narrow pass at Thermopylae wasn't just a defensive position, it was a force multiplier, turning 300 Spartans into an immovable object against Persia's unstoppable force. Leonidas didn't choose this battleground by accident. The Hot Gates, named for its nearby sulfur springs, compressed the Persian army into a corridor barely 50 feet wide where their numbers meant nothing. Cliffs rose on one side, the sea lapped on the other, and in between stood a wall of bronze shields and spear points. Every Persian charge shattered against that Spartan phalanx like waves against a cliff, their superior mobility and archery rendered useless in the crush. The terrain didn't just favor the defenders, it weaponized their discipline, but Thermopylae's genius went deeper than geography. Leonidas understood psychology as well as tactics. By forcing the Persians to attack head-on, he turned their greatest strength, their vast army, into a liability. Each failed assault demoralized Xerxes' troops more than the last, while the Spartans grew bolder, their defiant laughter echoing off the cliffs. The trap wasn't just physical, it was existential. Every hour the Persians delayed eroded their reputation as an invincible force. The hot gates became a stage where 300 men exposed the fragility of an empire's myth. Yet Thermopylae also reveals the limits of even the perfect trap. For all its brilliance, the strategy hinged on one vulnerable element, the secret mountain path. When a local traitor revealed the Anapaea route to Xerxes, the Persians flanked the Spartans, rendering their positional advantage obsolete. This wasn't a failure of planning. Leonidas had stationed allies to guard the path, but a reminder that no defense is foolproof. The real lesson of Thermopylae isn't that terrain wins battles, but that it buys time. Those 3 days of resistance gave Greece the breathing room to rally, turning a tactical defeat into a strategic victory. The Spartans knew they'd die. What mattered was making their deaths count. What makes Thermopylae timeless isn't the last stand itself, but what it represents: the power of constraints. In warfare, as in life, limitations breed creativity. Faced with impossible odds, Leonidas didn't seek open ground. He found a bottleneck where courage and discipline could outweigh numbers. Modern militaries still study this principle, from urban combat to cybersecurity. The Spartans proved that sometimes the best way to face a giant isn't to match its strength, but to choose a battlefield where its size becomes its weakness. Thermopylae wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in turning the world itself into an ally. The Aztec flower wars were warfare disguised as ceremony, a slow, deliberate strangulation wrapped in the pageantry of ritual. On the surface, these clashes seemed almost sportsmanlike. Opposing armies met at prearranged times, fought with ceremonial obsidian blades, and took captives rather than slaughtering indiscriminately. But beneath the spectacle lay a cold calculation. By framing battles as sacred obligations, the Aztecs lured rival city-states into a cycle of attrition, bleeding them dry without the cost of all-out war. Each flowered battle, named for the blossoms warriors wore as symbols of honor, weakened enemies just enough to keep them dependent, never strong enough to rebel. What made this trap so insidious was its double-edged psychology. Rivals accepted the flower wars because they believed in the shared fiction of divine purpose. The Aztecs didn't just exploit military weakness, they weaponized faith itself. Imagine a neighboring kingdom, its young warriors vanishing year after year, their absence justified by the promise of glory in the afterlife. Meanwhile, Tenochtitlan grew stronger, its armies seasoned by constant combat, while its enemies lost generation after generation to the altar stones. The genius wasn't in the fighting, it was in making the victims complicit in their own downfall. Yet rituals once established are hard to break. The Aztecs became prisoners of their own deception. Over time, their warrior class grew addicted to the predictable rhythm of flower wars, where victory was assured and captives flowed like tribute. When Cortés arrived, bringing the chaos of total war, the Aztec military struggled to adapt. Their tactics, honed for ceremonial combat, faltered against Spanish ambushes and cavalry charges. The very tradition that had sustained their empire now left them vulnerable, a reminder that traps meant to control others can eventually ensnare their creators. The Flower Wars' legacy isn't just one of strategy gone awry. They reveal a universal truth about power. The most effective traps don't feel like traps at all. They feel like tradition, like honor, like the way things have always been. And that's what makes them so dangerous, because by the time the ruse is revealed, it's often too late to fight back. The Assyrian siege towers weren't just weapons, they were props in an elaborate theatrical production, designed to manipulate attention itself. Picture a fortified city under threat, its defenders watching in dread as towering wooden beasts rolled toward their walls. Soldiers scrambled to reinforce the gates, archers took position, and boiling oil was prepared, all focused on the looming threat. But what they didn't know was that these were decoys, hollow facades packed with nothing but air and psychological weight. While defenders fixated on the false towers, Assyrian sappers were already tunneling beneath distant sections of the wall or scaling undefended battlements with ladders. By the time the ruse was discovered, it was too late. The real attack had already begun. This strategy worked because it exploited a fundamental quirk of human psychology. Our brains are wired to prioritize visible, immediate threats over abstract possibilities. A siege tower creaking toward your position demands action. A whispered rumor of miners digging underground feels distant, almost hypothetical. The Assyrians didn't just understand this bias, they weaponized it. Their decoy towers were meticulously crafted to look identical to the real things, complete with fake siege crews shouting orders and archers firing harmless volleys. The more convincing the performance, the more completely defenders would commit their resources to the wrong crisis. What's often overlooked is how this tactic played on the social dynamics of defense. Ancient cities weren't just protected by soldiers, they relied on civilians to bolster walls during attacks. When a decoy tower appeared, every able-bodied person rushed to the perceived point of danger, leaving other sections of the city vulnerable. The Assyrians didn't just misdirect their enemies, they orchestrated a mass movement of people, creating gaps where none had existed before. It was crowd control on a military scale, turning panic into an unwitting ally. Yet the brilliance of the fake siege towers lay in their adaptability. Unlike static traps, they could be repositioned, rebuilt, or even abandoned mid-battle to maintain the illusion. Some accounts suggest the Assyrians would occasionally let defenders capture a decoy, reinforcing the belief that they'd thwarted the real threat, only to strike elsewhere while celebrations began. This layered deception reveals a deeper truth about ancient warfare. The best traps weren't just physical, they were narratives, stories that enemies told themselves, and the Assyrians were master storytellers. The legacy of these decoys stretches far beyond the ancient world. Modern militaries still use diversionary tactics, from dummy tanks to electronic warfare that creates phantom armies on radar. But the core principle remains unchanged. In conflict, what you see is rarely the real danger. The Assyrians proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a battering ram or a sword. It's the ability to make your enemy look the wrong way at the exact moment you strike. The Inca suspension bridges were masterpieces of engineering, woven from sturdy grass ropes, anchored to stone pylons, and capable of bearing the weight of entire armies. But in wartime, these marvels of infrastructure became something far more sinister, death traps disguised as safe passage. Picture a column of enemy soldiers cautiously crossing one of these swaying bridges, high above a roaring river gorge. The structure holds firm beneath their first steps, lulling them into confidence. Then, at the precise moment the bulk of their force is mid-span, hidden teams of Inca warriors slice the support cables with obsidian blades. The bridge doesn't just collapse, it unravels in seconds, sending screaming troops and their supplies plunging into the abyss below. What made these bridge ambushes so devastating wasn't just the physics of the drop, it was the psychology of betrayal. In peacetime, the Incas maintained an extensive network of these bridges, vital for trade and communication across their mountainous empire. Enemy armies knew these crossings were reliable, often relying on them during invasions. The Incas weaponized that trust, letting adversaries grow comfortable with the infrastructure before turning it against them. Unlike obvious traps like pitfalls or spikes, these bridges offered no warning. The very thing that seemed like a logistical advantage became a fatal liability. The timing of these ambushes reveals another layer of Inca brilliance. Cutting the ropes too early would only claim a few scouts. Too late, and the bulk of the army might escape. Inca lookouts used signal mirrors to coordinate the perfect moment, when the enemy's heaviest troops or commanders were at the bridge's weakest point. Some accounts suggest they even staged mock retreats to lure pursuers onto the spans, making the trap feel like the enemy's own mistake. This wasn't just sabotage, it was theater, with every element choreographed for maximum psychological impact. Yet the true genius of these bridges lay in their recoverability. Unlike destroyed stone bridges that took years to rebuild, Inca suspension bridges could be re-knotted in days. The same teams that severed the ropes could return to weave new ones, often before the enemy realized the ambush was deliberate. This allowed the Incas to reuse the same crossings as traps repeatedly, each time letting their foes believe the collapse was an accident of wear or weather. The bridges became Schrödinger's trap, both functional and fatal, until the moment the Incas chose which outcome to enact. Modern militaries still study these tactics, from sabotaging supply routes to cyber warfare that turns an opponent's networks against them. But the Inca bridge ambushes offer a timeless lesson. In conflict, the most dangerous threats aren't the obvious ones. They're the systems you rely on, the paths you trust until the moment they're weaponized. The Incas didn't just build bridges, they built illusions of safety, then shattered them with a single, calculated cut. The Celtic Wicker Man wasn't just an execution method, it was a psychological weapon of mass intimidation, designed to haunt enemies long before battle began. Picture a towering effigy of woven branches, its hollow belly crammed with prisoners of war, set ablaze against the twilight sky. The screams, the smoke, the silhouette of flames licking at the night, every detail was calculated to break morale before a single sword was drawn. The Celts understood something primal about warfare. Fear could rout an army faster than any cavalry charge. By turning punishment into theater, they didn't just kill their enemies, they made them question whether resistance was worth the cost. What made the Wicker Man so effective wasn't just its brutality, it was the way it exploited shared cultural memory. Fire held sacred significance across many ancient societies, often associated with purification or divine judgment. The Celts weaponized that symbolism, framing the executions as both a sacrifice and a warning. Enemy tribes didn't just see a gruesome spectacle, they witnessed what looked like a ritual blessed by the gods themselves. This blurred the line between military tactic and supernatural omen, making resistance feel like defiance of divine will. The psychological impact rippled far beyond the immediate victims. Survivors spread tales of the Wicker Man, amplifying its terror with each retelling. Yet this very effectiveness contained the seeds of its downfall. The Wicker Man's horror was so extreme it often backfired, transforming scattered tribes into unified coalitions against the Celts. When Rome's legions advanced into Gaul, they found allies among tribes traumatized by these spectacles. Julius Caesar himself documented the practice, using it as propaganda to justify his campaigns, framing Rome as a liberator rather than an invader. The Wicker Man became a cautionary tale in the dangers of overplaying fear as a strategy when intimidation crosses into atrocity. It can forge bonds between former enemies. The trap's legacy lies in its paradox. For all its short-term effectiveness, the Wicker Man revealed a timeless truth about psychological warfare. There's a threshold beyond which terror ceases to paralyze and instead galvanizes. Modern militaries still study this balance, from shock and/or tactics to propaganda campaigns. But the Celts learned the hard way that the most potent weapons aren't always the loudest or the cruelest. Sometimes the fear you inspire doesn't weaken your enemies. It gives them something far more dangerous, a reason to stand together. The Japanese ninja caltrops prove that size means nothing when it comes to lethality. These tiny spiked stars, small enough to fit in a palm, could cripple an entire cavalry charge. Unlike grand siege engines or towering traps, caltrops were the ultimate minimalist weapon, designed to exploit one universal truth: every army, no matter how disciplined, depends on the ability to move. Scattered across roads or tossed behind during a retreat, their four sharpened points always landed with one spike facing upward, ready to pierce sandals, hooves, or bare feet with ruthless efficiency. A single handful could turn a clear path into a minefield of agony, slowing pursuers to a pained shuffle while the ninja vanished into the night. But the real genius of the caltrop wasn't just its physics, it was its psychology. Unlike obvious barriers like walls or ditches, these traps were nearly invisible until it was too late. Imagine being a samurai charging through tall grass, your focus locked on the fleeing enemy, only to feel a searing spike drive through your foot. The shock alone was enough to break momentum, but the lingering damage, infected wounds, immobilized soldiers rippled far beyond the initial ambush. Ninjas understood that disruption didn't require massive force, it required precision. A well-placed caltrop didn't just wound, it planted doubt, making every step forward feel like a gamble. Samurai countered these traps with a mix of ingenuity and discipline. Scouts would sweep roads with weighted nets or wooden boards, flipping the spikes harmlessly aside. Some warriors wore reinforced sandals with thick soles, trading speed for protection. But the most effective defense was awareness, training troops to recognize the ninja's favorite tactics. Caltrops near riverbanks where pursuers would dismount, or clustered at forest edges where shadows hid the danger. Over time, samurai developed an almost ritualistic caution, pausing to scan terrain that their enemies might have weaponized. In a way, the caltrop's greatest impact wasn't the injuries it caused, but the paranoia it bred. What makes these tiny weapons timeless is their adaptability. Centuries later, modern militaries still use variations from anti-personnel spikes to tire-puncturing devices. The principle remains unchanged. Sometimes the smallest obstacle can dictate the pace of battle. Ninjas didn't need to outfight their enemies. They just needed to make every step hurt. And in that simplicity lies a brutal lesson: warfare isn't always about overpowering your opponent. Sometimes it's about making them hesitate long enough for you to disappear. The Egyptian sand traps transformed the desert itself into a silent sentinel, proving that sometimes the earth could be deadlier than any blade. Picture a line of enemy chariots racing across what appears to be flat, stable ground, only for the lead horses to suddenly vanish, their screams muffled as they plunge into hidden pits deeper than a man's height. Behind them, momentum becomes a curse as chariots pile into the gap, wheels snapping, riders thrown into spikes lining the pit's bottom. Unlike trenches dug in haste, these traps were meticulously engineered, their edges reinforced with woven reeds to prevent collapse, their depths calculated to ensure no escape. And then, with cruel efficiency, the wind would blur the pit's edges within hours, leaving no trace for the next wave of attackers. What made these pits uniquely terrifying wasn't just their brutality, it was their democracy. They didn't discriminate between foot soldiers and kings. A pharaoh's elite charioteers could be undone as easily as a conscripted infantryman, their vaunted speed and mobility rendered meaningless. The Egyptians understood that in warfare, unpredictability is its own weapon. While other cultures built walls or forts, they weaponized emptiness, turning the desert's featureless expanse into a chessboard where every square might conceal disaster. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the physical toll. Survivors would describe the horror of watching comrades disappear without warning, the ground itself seeming to conspire against them. Unlike arrows or spears, which came from a visible direction, the sand offered no clues, no enemy to strike back against. This eroded morale in ways direct calm. But couldn't how do you rally troops when the very earth beneath them might betray them at any moment? Even worse, the pits couldn't be conquered like a fortress. There was no glory in bypassing them, only the lingering fear that the next dune might be the last. But the real brilliance lay in the trap's sustainability. Unlike moats or wooden barricades that required maintenance, the desert did the Egyptians' work for them. Sandstorms would refill pits after use, allowing them to be reused indefinitely. Scouts could mark their locations with subtle, seemingly natural landmarks, a slightly darker stone, a tuft of desert grass creating a lethal maze only they could navigate. Some historians believe they even exploited animal behavior, digging near known watering holes where enemy forces would inevitably cluster. The lesson was clear. In warfare, the environment isn't just terrain, it's a co-conspirator. Modern militaries still study these tactics, from camouflaged landmines to drone surveillance that reads terrain for ambush opportunities. Yet the sand trap's greatest legacy might be their reminder that the most effective defenses don't always look like defenses at all. The Egyptians didn't just dig holes, they weaponized imagination, forcing every invader to wonder whether the next step would be their last, and in that uncertainty lay their true victory. The Viking shield wall feint was less a tactical retreat than a choreographed dance of death, where every backward step was an invitation to disaster. Picture a line of Norse warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, their round shields overlapping like scales on a serpent, when suddenly the center appears to waver. To an attacking force, it looks like weakness, fatigue, perhaps even panic. But this collapse is as deliberate as a spider drawing in its prey. The moment enemies surge forward, lured by the promise of a breakthrough, the flanks of the shield wall pivot inward with terrifying precision, folding around the attackers like iron jaws. What began as a frontal assault becomes a slaughterhouse, with the Vikings' so-called retreat transforming into a three-sided killing box. What made this maneuver so devastating wasn't just its geometry, it was the psychology behind it. Viking warlords understood that most warriors, no matter how disciplined, struggled to resist the instinct to chase a fleeing foe. The feint weaponized that impulse, turning aggression into a liability. Imagine being a Saxon soldier, your blood up after hours of clashing shields, seeing the enemy line finally crack. The temptation to push forward would be overwhelming, especially for younger fighters eager to prove themselves. But the Vikings weren't just exploiting recklessness, they were exploiting hierarchy. When a chieftain or noble led the charge into the gap, their followers had no choice but to surge after them, even as the trap closed at their backs. The shield wall's true genius lay in its dual nature. To outsiders, it seemed like a static defense, a brute force tactic. But in reality, it was a fluid instrument of deception, requiring near telepathic coordination. Each warrior had to know exactly when to yield ground, how far to retreat, and critically when to halt and counterattack. Hesitation meant death, overcommitment spoiled the ruse. Historical accounts suggest signals were subtle, a shifted grip on a spear, a particular cry passed down the line, ensuring the feint looked chaotic to enemies but remained tightly controlled. This wasn't a wild melee. It was a performance where every actor knew their role. Yet the feint's effectiveness also reveals a darker truth about ancient warfare. Success often depended on the enemy's incompetence. Against a disciplined force that refused to take the bait, the maneuver risked collapsing into genuine retreat. The Vikings' greatest victories, like their massacre of the Saxon, feared at Ashdown, came against opponents who lacked their level of coordination. When facing equally savvy foes, like the Frankish heavy cavalry who could outmaneuver the shield wall, the tactic faltered. That's the paradox of all traps. They're only as lethal as the enemy is predictable. Modern military theorists still study the shield wall feint, not for its shield formations but for its underlying principles. Special forces use similar, elastic defense tactics, luring insurgents into kill zones before encircling them. Even in cybersecurity, honeypot traps mimic the Viking ruse, baiting hackers into fake vulnerabilities only to trace their attacks. But the shield wall's real legacy is its reminder that the best deceptions aren't just about lying to the enemy, they're about letting the enemy lie to themselves. The Vikings didn't just break their own line that day, they broke their opponent's ability to trust what they saw. The Indian elephant stampede wasn't just a display of brute force, it was a carefully orchestrated illusion of chaos, where the line between weapon and trap blurred into something far more devious. Picture the scene: a dozen armored elephants thundering toward enemy lines, their tusks fitted with iron spikes, their sheer mass scattering formations like leaves in a storm. To opposing soldiers, the immediate threat was obvious: avoid being trampled or gored. But the real danger lay in what came next. As enemies scrambled away from the charging beasts, they'd often funnel into prearranged kill zones littered with camouflaged pits or sharpened stakes. The elephants weren't just weapons, they were shepherds herding prey into a slaughterhouse of their own making. What made this tactic so terrifying was its psychological duality. Elephants weren't just feared for their size, they were revered as semi-divine creatures in many cultures, their presence alone shaking morale. When the Mauryan Empire deployed them, the effect was as much spiritual as it was physical. Soldiers who might stand firm against cavalry often broke at the sight of these living battering rams, their discipline crumbling under the primal urge to flee. And that's when the trap sprang shut. The moment enemies turned their backs, they became vulnerable to the hidden spikes, archers positioned in trees, or secondary cavalry charges waiting just out of sight. The stampede wasn't the end game, it was the first move in a lethal chess match. Yet the elephants' greatest strength, their unpredictability, was also their undoing. For every victorious charge, there were accounts of panicked beasts turning on their own handlers, their loyalty frayed by pain or confusion. At the Battle of Hydaspes, Alexander the Great exploited this flaw brilliantly. His troops used flaming arrows and deafening war horns to spook Porus's elephants, sending them crashing back into their own lines. The lesson was clear: an elephant could be as dangerous to its allies as to its enemies. Over time, as armies developed more reliable weapons like catapults and disciplined cavalry, the risks of fielding elephants began to outweigh their rewards. The stampede's legacy isn't just about raw power, it's about the delicate balance between control and chaos. Modern militaries still grapple with this principle, whether deploying drones or cyber weapons, where a tool's effectiveness hinges on its precision. The Mauryans understood that the best traps aren't just about force, they're about directing that force with surgical intent. Elephants may have faded from battlefields, but their lesson endures. True power lies not in unleashing chaos, but in harnessing it. The Korean hwacha wasn't just a weapon, it was a storm of fire and splinters unleashed with a single pull of a lever. Picture a wooden cart bristling with dozens of rocket-propelled arrows, each tipped with gunpowder and wrapped in oil-soaked cloth. When ignited, the entire payload launched in a deafening roar, arcing through the sky like a swarm of vengeful hornets before raining down on enemy formations. Unlike traditional archery, which relied on precision and discipline, the H-Watcher embraced chaos as a virtue. It didn't need to pick targets. It turned entire swaths of the battlefield into kill zones, where survival was less about skill and more about sheer luck. What made this device so revolutionary wasn't just its firepower, it was its psychological terror. Imagine standing in an advancing army, watching dark streaks ignite against the horizon, knowing that in seconds, the air itself would turn against you. The arrows didn't just pierce, they exploded on impact, spraying shrapnel and flames in all directions. Even if the initial barrage didn't kill, it shattered morale. Troops trained to hold formations suddenly found themselves torn between duty and the primal urge to scatter. And that was the H-Watcher's true purpose: to disrupt, to disorient, to turn order into panic long before melee combat began. Yet every innovation breeds countermeasures. Opponents quickly learned that standing still meant annihilation. Light cavalry, once relegated to scouting, became indispensable for their ability to outrun the H-Watcher's killing radius. Some commanders spread their forces into loose, irregular formations, minimizing the damage of each volley. Others attacked at night or in heavy fog, when the H-Watcher's operators struggled to gauge distance. The Japanese, during their invasions of Korea, even deployed portable wooden shields reinforced with wet hides, crude but effective barriers against the fire arrows. Adaptation became a matter of life or death, proving that no weapon, no matter how fearsome, is invincible forever. The H-Watcher's legacy lies in its paradox. It was both ahead of its time and deeply flawed. While it dominated open battlefields, it struggled in rough terrain or against fast-moving foes. Reloading took precious minutes, leaving crews vulnerable to counterattacks. And like all gunpowder weapons of the era, rain or humidity could render it useless. Yet its influence endured. Modern multiple rocket launchers, from the Katyusha of World War II to today's precision-guided systems, owe a conceptual debt to this medieval marvel. The H-Watcher proved that sometimes overwhelming force isn't about accuracy. It's about making sure your enemy knows nowhere is safe. But here's the twist: the H-Watcher's greatest impact wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the arms race it sparked. After facing these barrages, armies across Asia began prioritizing mobility over armor, speed over sheer numbers. The age of static warfare was ending, and the H-Watcher, ironically, helped usher in the very tactics that would render it obsolete. That's the cycle of military innovation. Today's unstoppable weapon is tomorrow's museum piece, but the lessons it teaches reshape warfare forever. The Scythian poisoned arrows turned the vast steppes into a land where every scratch could be fatal, where survival hinged not on the depth of a wound, but the speed of its venom. These nomadic warriors didn't just rely on accuracy or force. They weaponized nature itself, dipping arrowheads in a cocktail of snake venom, rotting blood, and toxic plant extracts. A grazed arm that might have been a minor inconvenience in other battles became a death warrant, with victims succumbing to agony within hours. But the true horror wasn't just the poison, it was the psychological torment. Imagine being a soldier watching a comrade collapse from a seemingly harmless nick, his body convulsing as the toxin spread. Suddenly, the entire battlefield felt contaminated. What set the Scythians apart wasn't just their ingredients, it was their sourcing. They harvested venom from steppe vipers, a species so potent its bite could kill a horse. By layering toxins with fermented animal blood, they created a breeding ground for infection, ensuring even those who survived the venom might die from gangrene. This wasn't just chemistry, it was biological warfare centuries ahead of its time. Opponents quickly learned that standard battlefield medicine was useless. Bandages couldn't stop venom, and cauterizing wounds only sealed in the poison. The Scythians had effectively rewritten the rules of engagement. Now, even a missed shot held value, as arrows embedded in the ground became hidden hazards for barefoot troops or grazing horses. The psychological ripple effect was even more devastating. Armies that would have shrugged off light arrow volleys began flinching at the slightest whistle of a shaft. Skirmishes that might have been probing maneuvers turned into life or death struggles, because every exchange carried existential risk. Persian chronicles recount soldiers wrapping themselves in extra layers of cloth in desperate attempts to shield against scratches, a futile effort that only slowed them down in the searing steppe heat. The Scythians didn't just kill with their arrows, they forced their enemies to exhaust themselves through paranoia. Yet this tactic had an unexpected weakness. It demanded perfect conditions. Rain could wash venom from arrowheads, and prolonged exposure to air diminished its potency. The Scythians solved this with intricate carrying cases, damp leather quivers that preserved the toxins, and a ritual of re-dipping arrows before battle. Their entire warfare revolved around timing and terrain, choosing to engage when the winds favored their poison clouds or when enemies were funneled into valleys with no escape from the creeping death. Modern militaries still grapple with the ethics and efficacy of poisoned weapons, from chemical agents to radioactive munitions, but the Scythian arrows offer a chilling lesson. Sometimes the smallest delivery system can inflict the deepest fear. They proved that victory doesn't always go to the strongest army, but to the one that makes every minor wound feel like a mortal threat. In the end, their greatest weapon wasn't the venom. It was the doubt they planted in every enemy's mind long before the first arrow flew. The Roman testudo wasn't just a shield formation. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare disguised as defense. Picture a century of legionaries moving as one, their rectangular scutum shields interlocking overhead and along the sides like the scales of an iron tortoise. To enemy archers, it must have been infuriating, a slow, impenetrable advance that mocked their efforts as arrows clattered harmlessly against the wooden shell. But the brilliance of the testudo wasn't just in its ability to deflect missiles. It was in the way it manipulated enemies into exhausting their most precious resources. Every volley wasted against that shield wall was one less arrow to face later, when the Romans finally closed the distance and unleashed their deadly gladius swords. What made this formation so devastating was its deceptive simplicity. Most ancient armies relied on speed or aggression to overwhelm foes, but the testudo flipped that logic on its head. By moving deliberately, almost methodically, the Romans forced their enemies to make the first mistake. Archers, confident they could pierce any defense, would empty their quivers in frustration, only to realize too late that they'd played into Rome's hands. Even more demoralizing, the testudo's eerie silence. Unlike the war cries of charging barbarians, the only sound was the rhythmic tramp of sandals and the occasional thunk of arrows meeting shields, a chilling reminder that discipline, not frenzy, would decide this fight. Yet the testudo's greatest strength, its near-impenetrable defense, was also its fatal flaw. The formation sacrificed all mobility for protection. Deploying it required perfect synchronization. A single gap in the shields could spell disaster. And once engaged, the Romans couldn't easily pivot or pursue a fleeing enemy. At the Battle of Carrhae, this weakness proved catastrophic. Parthian horse archers, recognizing the testudo's sluggishness, simply circled beyond its reach, peppering the trapped legionaries until exhaustion and thirst did what arrows could not. The lesson was brutal but clear. No tactic, no matter how ingenious, is invincible against an adaptable foe. The testudo's legacy endures not just in military history, but in the philosophy of conflict itself. It proved that sometimes the best offense is a defense so unshakable it forces your enemy to defeat themselves. Modern riot police use variations of the formation, their shields forming a moving barricade against projectiles. Even in cybersecurity, the principle holds. A well-designed firewall doesn't just block attacks, it wastes hackers' time and resources until they give up. The Romans didn't just build a wall of shields that day, they built a mirror reflecting their enemies' own impatience and desperation back at them, and in that reflection, battles were won before the first sword was drawn. The Native American false camps were more than just decoys, they were entire theaters of deception, meticulously staged to exploit the invaders' hunger for an easy victory. Picture a clearing in the woods dotted with what appeared to be hastily abandoned tents, cold campfires still smoldering, and scattered belongings suggesting a panicked retreat. To European settlers and soldiers, these scenes screamed vulnerability, an opportunity to strike a decisive blow against an elusive foe. But the moment they rushed in, the forest itself would come alive. Warriors hidden in the trees unleashed volleys of arrows, while others cut off retreat routes with sudden barricades of fallen logs. What looked like a defenseless camp was actually a carefully measured killing zone, designed to turn arrogance into annihilation. This strategy worked because it played on a fundamental misunderstanding between cultures. European militaries expected battles to unfold in predictable ways, set-piece engagements where lines clashed in open fields. The false camps weaponized that expectation, luring opponents into environments where traditional tactics were useless. The settlers' own confidence became their downfall. They assumed disarray meant weakness, not realizing it was a calculated ruse. For native tribes, warfare wasn't just about strength, it was about control, choosing when, where, and how the fight would happen. By letting their enemies believe they held the advantage, they turned every overconfident charge into a death sentence. But the brilliance of these decoy camps lay in their adaptability. Unlike static traps, they could be tailored to specific enemies. Against cavalry, tribes might leave trails just wide enough to tempt a pursuit, only to funnel riders into hidden pits or tangled thickets where horses became liabilities. Against infantry, they'd scatter seemingly valuable goods, blankets, tools, to slow looters and distract them before the ambush struck. Some accounts even describe mock camps positioned near rivers, where attackers would be pinned against the water's edge with no escape. The details changed, but the principle remained. Let the enemy's assumptions guide them straight into a trap of their own making. Settlers eventually countered this tactic by adopting a grim but effective strategy, distrusting anything that seemed too convenient. Scouts learned to study camps for signs of staged disarray, footprints leading nowhere, fires placed too evenly to be accidental. Commanders like George Washington documented these lessons, emphasizing patience over impulsiveness. Yet the deeper lesson wasn't just about vigilance, it was about cultural humility. The tribe's success hinged on exploiting a mindset that viewed them as disorganized or primitive. Only when settlers abandoned those prejudices could they see the traps for what they were, masterpieces of psychological warfare. The false camp's legacy isn't just a tale of ambushes and arrows. It's a reminder that in conflict, the most dangerous traps aren't the ones you see, they're the ones you walk into because you refuse to question your own assumptions. The tribes didn't just build decoys that day, they built mirrors, forcing their enemies to confront the arrogance that blinded them. And in that reflection, the real battle was always fought long before the first arrow flew. The Macedonian Sarissa phalanx didn't just dominate battlefields, it rewrote the rules of engagement, turning what looked like a static wall of spears into a dynamic death trap. Picture a forest of 18-foot pikes, each wielded by a soldier trained to move as a single organism, their formation so tight that shields overlapped like scales on a dragon. To enemy cavalry, this bristling fortress seemed like madness to charge head-on. That's exactly what Philip Roman II wanted them to think. Behind the phalanx's imposing front lay a devious secret, carefully disguised pits and staggered trenches, invisible until horses were already mid-gallop. The moment cavalry veered to flank what they thought was an immobile formation, the ground vanished beneath them and the phalanx would pivot, its rear ranks lowering their sarissas to impale both horse and rider in a gruesome welcome. What made this system so lethal wasn't just the coordination, it was the psychology of forced choices. Opponents faced an impossible dilemma: charge the spear wall and risk annihilation, or attempt a flanking maneuver and plunge into hidden hazards. The phalanx's real genius was its ability to funnel enemies into decisions where every option was wrong. Alexander the Great perfected this at Gorgamela, where Persian cavalry, confident in their mobility, split to outflank the Macedonians only to find themselves trapped between the advancing phalanx and pre-dug ditches. The sarissas didn't just kill, they herded, turning the enemy's own momentum against them. Yet the phalanx's dominance reveals a deeper truth about ancient warfare: adaptability beats brute force. The Romans eventually cracked the code not by overpowering the pikes, but by disrupting their cohesion. At Cynocephaly, legionaries exploited uneven terrain to slip between sarissa shafts, turning the phalanx's rigidity into a fatal weakness. The lesson: even the most ingenious trap has a shelf life. Philip and Alexander's system thrived because it exploited the tactical assumptions of its time. But when those assumptions changed, the phalanx's brilliance became its Achilles heel. The sarissa phalanx's legacy isn't just in its victories, but in its reminder that the best traps aren't static. They're ecosystems of pressure and misdirection, where every visible threat hides an invisible one. Modern militaries still echo this principle, from kill boxes in urban combat to cyber decoys that lure hackers into digital dead ends. The Macedonians didn't just build a wall of spears, they built a labyrinth where every path led to ruin. And for a glorious, bloody century, the world had no answer. The Swiss pike square wasn't just a formation, it was a brutal paradox, a trap disguised as an invitation. Picture a dense block of mercenaries, their 18-foot pikes leveled in every direction like the quills of a porcupine, standing motionless on the battlefield. To charging knights, it looked like a static target, ripe for annihilation. But the moment their warhorses closed the distance, the square would reveal its hidden teeth, razor-sharp spikes embedded in the ground just beyond the pike tips, angled to impale charging steeds at belly height. What seemed like a vulnerable infantry cluster was actually a meat grinder, where the enemy's own momentum did most of the killing. What made this tactic so devastating wasn't just the spikes, it was the psychology of inevitability. Cavalry charges relied on shock and terror to break formations, but the Swiss turned that logic inside out. Their squares didn't flinch, they didn't scatter. They stood with eerie discipline, forcing knights to confront a grim calculus, pull up short and be skewered by pikes, or plunge forward and gut their own mounts on the hidden stakes. Either way, the charge dissolved into chaos, leaving horsemen tangled in their own dying animals, while Swiss halberdiers surged forward to finish the job. The pike square's deadliest innovation was its adaptability. Unlike static traps, it could move. During battles like Nancy in 1477, Swiss commanders feigned disorder, luring Burgundian knights into pursuing what appeared to be a retreating force, only to pivot into a perfect square at the last moment, spikes already deployed. The knights, committed to their charge, had no time to react. This wasn't just defense, it was predatory patience, the tactical equivalent of a spider letting its prey stumble into the web. Yet the square's dominance contained the seeds of its downfall. Gunpowder didn't just outrange pikes, it shattered the formation's cohesion. At the Battle of Bicocca in 1522, Spanish arquebusiers positioned behind earthworks mowed down advancing Swiss squares before they could close the distance. The mercenaries, trained for melee supremacy, had no answer for bullets that killed from hundreds of yards away. The very discipline that made them unstoppable in close combat became a liability against firearms standing shoulder to shoulder, just made them easier targets. But here's the twist: the pike square's legacy wasn't erased by gunpowder, it evolved. Dutch and Swedish armies later combined pikes with muskets in hybrid formations, proving that old tactics could find new life. The lesson wasn't that melee traps became obsolete, but that every innovation eventually meets its counter. The Swiss didn't just teach the world how to kill cavalry. They taught a harder truth: in warfare, today's unstoppable strategy is tomorrow's cautionary tale. Their squares didn't fail because they were flawed. They fell because warfare refuses to stand still. From the hollow logs that mimicked armies to the Swiss pike squares that turned charges into suicide, these 23 traps share a chilling common thread. They prove that victory often belongs to those who think differently, not just those who fight harder. Every civilization, from the Mongols to the Maya, understood that warfare wasn't just about strength. It was about theater, misdirection, and the art of making your enemy's confidence their downfall. The Trojan Horse didn't just breach walls, it breached trust. The Viet Cong tunnels didn't just hide soldiers, they weaponized the very earth. Even the simplest innovations, like the ninja's caltrops or the Scythians' poisoned arrows, reveal how deeply ancient warriors understood human nature. Fear, pride, even the basic instinct to flee or chase, all could be twisted into traps more lethal than any blade. What's astonishing isn't just the diversity of these tactics, but how many still resonate today. Modern drones mimic the H-Watch's indiscriminate barrage. Cyber attacks exploit trust like the Trojan Horse. The Viet Cong's tunnel networks inspired insurgent tactics from Afghanistan to Iraq. Even the Swiss pike square's disciplined formation finds echoes in riot police shield walls. The tools have changed, but the principles endure. Control the narrative, dictate the terms, and never let your enemy fight the battle they prepared for. Yet perhaps the most enduring lesson isn't about warfare at all, it's about ingenuity under pressure. These traps weren't dreamed up in safety. They were born from desperation, from facing impossible odds with nothing but creativity. The Carthaginians, outgunned at sea, didn't surrender, they set their own ships on fire. The Incas, lacking steel, turned bridges into snares. History rewards those who adapt and punishes those who assume the rules will never change. So which of these traps left you awestruck? Was it the Byzantine Greek Fire, so terrifying it felt supernatural, or the Mongol fake retreats, where every feigned panic was a death sentence in disguise? Drop your favorites in the comments. We love geeking out over these details with you. And if you enjoyed this dive into history's darkest innovations, hit subscribe. After all, the past is full of twists, betrayals, and strokes of brilliance that still shape our world. Because whether on a battlefield or in everyday life, one truth remains: the deadliest threats are rarely the ones you expect. They're the ones you never see.